From the hallowed halls of empires long crumbled to dust, whispers often emerge, tales so audacious, so profoundly unsettling. They challenge the very fabric of our understanding of human ambition and the depths of despair to which power can drive a soul. Today, we delve into one such narrative, a story of desperation etched into the forgotten scrolls of a shadowy empire, a saga that culminates in an act so taboo, so utterly unthinkable, it reverberates through time as a chilling testament to the lengths a ruler might go to cling to a dying throne. This is the tragic, harrowing chronicle of Emperor Valerius, a man whose desperate grasp for power led him down a path of unimaginable transgression, the marriage of his own daughter, a bond forged in fear, cemented in desperation, and forever stained by an unforgivable act of familial violation, all in the name of political survival. His empire, once vast and formidable, stretching its tendrils across continents, had begun to fray at the edges, its once indomitable legions now thinned and weary, its coffers emptying, and its people restless under the weight of perpetual strife. The very air of the capital, once redolent with the scent of prosperity and imperial might, now carried the subtle tang of decay, a scent perceptible only to those with the keenest senses, like the emperor himself, a man burdened by the colossal weight of a fracturing world. Valerius, born into the purple, ascended to the throne of the Shadow Empire, not in a golden age, but in its twilight. His early reign, though marked by a facade of stability, was a constant, exhausting battle against the encroaching tides of chaos. He was a man of keen intellect, schooled in strategy and rhetoric, with a formidable will that had, for decades, held the fragmented pieces of his patrimony together. He had envisioned himself as a restorer, a second founder, a figure who would pull his civilization back from the precipice, ushering in a new era of grandeur and unwavering dominion. He had, with fervent dedication and unyielding effort, poured his very essence into this monumental task, sacrificing personal comfort, enduring sleepless nights, and making decisions that weighed heavy upon his conscience, all for the perceived greater good of his vast and sprawling domain. Yet, despite his prodigious efforts, despite the cunning maneuvers and the hard-won victories on distant battlefields, the tide continued to turn against him. The external pressures were relentless. Barbarian hordes, seemingly endless in their numbers and insatiable in their hunger for plunder, gnawed at the northern frontiers, their guttural war cries echoing across the frozen plains, a constant, menacing drumbeat against the empire's weakening defenses. To the east, a resurgent rival empire, emboldened by Valerius's internal struggles, cast a covetous eye upon the fertile provinces and crucial trade routes, deploying its seasoned legions with a calculated, predatory precision. These were not mere skirmishes. They were existential threats, demanding vast resources, draining the imperial treasury, and stretching the patience and loyalty of his already beleaguered populace to their absolute breaking point. Internally, the situation was no less dire, perhaps even more insidious in its malignancy. The ancient nobility, once staunch pillars of imperial authority, had grown fat on corruption and privilege, their loyalty, now a fragile thing, easily swayed by whispers of dissent and the promise of increased power. They engaged in ceaseless, cutthroat rivalries, their petty squabbles undermining the very foundations of government, fracturing the cohesion of the court, and poisoning the wellsprings of trust that were so vital for effective governance. Each faction sought to elevate its own interests, to secure greater land, more influence, and preferential treatment, utterly oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the greater storm gathering on the horizon. The governors of distant provinces, emboldened by the weakening central authority and the emperor's preoccupation with external wars, began to carve out their own de facto kingdoms, collecting taxes for themselves, raising private armies, and governing with an autonomy that bordered on outright secession. A vast, intricate bureaucracy, once the marvel of the known world for its efficiency and reach, was now bloated and sclerotic, choked by inefficiency, graft, and paralyzing inertia. Decisions that once took days now languished for months, crucial. Reforms stalled indefinitely, and the wheels of governance ground to a near standstill, emitting groans of distress that were impossible for the emperor to ignore. The common people, caught between the insatiable demands of taxation for unending wars and the rapacious greed of local magnates, suffered immensely. Their fields lay fallow, their cities teemed with dispossessed refugees, and their faith in the imperial system, once unshakable, had begun to wane, replaced by a bitter cynicism and a palpable sense of hopelessness. Rebellion, a word once uttered only in hushed tones, now felt like a palpable threat, a flickering ember ready to ignite into a consuming conflagration across the provinces. In this maelstrom of decline, Valerius found himself isolated, his advisors often proving to be either sycophants, incompetents, or traitors. The pressure on him was immense, a crushing weight that bore down on his shoulders with relentless, unforgiving force, threatening to shatter his resolve. He paced the echoing halls of his palace, the intricate mosaics beneath his feet seeming to mock his dwindling authority. He stared out from his high windows at the sprawling city, once a vibrant tapestry of life and commerce, now a sprawling testament to the slow, agonizing decay that crept into every corner of his realm. He was a man drowning in the relentless currents of history, desperately searching for a lifeline, any lifeline, that might pull him back from the engulfing abyss. The imperial succession was, as always, a paramount concern, a matter of existential importance. Valerius had a son, a young man named Cassian, who was, unfortunately, ill-suited for the burdens of emperorship. Cassian was weak, susceptible to the dubious counsel of opportunistic courtiers, and lacked the iron will and strategic acumen that had defined his father's very survival. He spent his days in frivolous pursuits, oblivious to the storm gathering. On the horizon, his hands soft, his mind unburdened by the crushing realities that consumed his father's every waking moment. The thought of leaving the empire, in its fragile, precarious state, to such a successor filled Valerius with a profound, soul-chilling dread, a cold fear that gnawed at him incessantly. It was a prospect so horrifying that it eclipsed even the threat of barbarian invasion. A weak heir meant the immediate and irreversible collapse of everything he had fought so tirelessly to preserve. But Valerius also had a daughter, Aurelia. She was not merely a princess. She was a woman of extraordinary intellect, possessed of a keen political mind that often surpassed even the most seasoned senators. She was beautiful, yes, but her beauty was overshadowed by a fierce intelligence, a shrewd understanding of human nature, and a surprising strength of character that had blossomed amidst the palace intrigues. Aurelia, unlike her brother, understood the precariousness of their situation. She saw the encroaching darkness, sensed the pervasive fear, and grasped the immense challenges that threatened to consume their world. She possessed an unusual blend of her father's stoicism and a startling, innate strategic intuition. She had often sat in on private meetings, observing, listening, absorbing the complex discussions of statecraft, her youthful eyes missing nothing, her sharp mind processing every nuance of diplomacy and military strategy. She was a political asset of immense, untapped potential, a pawn on the imperial chessboard, whose value was becoming increasingly clear to the desperate emperor. Her quiet observations, her insightful questions, and her uncanny ability to predict the outcomes of certain political maneuvers had not gone unnoticed by Valerius. He saw in her a reflection of his own strength, a spirit untainted by the weaknesses that plagued his son and many of his supposed allies. He had often, in moments of extreme fatigue and utter despair, confided in her, speaking of the empire's woes, of the treachery that surrounded him, of the impossible choices that lay before him. Aurelia, in turn, had offered not platitudes, but thoughtful analysis, her youthful perspective often cutting through the dense fog of courtly deceit to reveal a stark, unvarnished truth. She was, in many ways, a son he wished he had, a daughter, who embodied the very essence of imperial fortitude and intellectual rigor. The crisis deepened, unrelenting in its grip. A major rebellion erupted in the eastern provinces, fueled by disgruntled landowners and ambitious local warlords, threatening to sever a vital artery of the empire's revenue and resources. The northern barbarians, emboldened by the news of internal strife, launched their largest invasion in decades, bypassing the traditional defenses and pushing deep into imperial territory, their depredations leaving a trail of devastation and despair. The capital itself was rife with whispers of conspiracy, plots to depose Valerius, to replace him with a more pliable figure, a puppet whose strings could be easily pulled by the shadowy factions vying for control. The loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, once unquestioning, now wavered, their allegiance bought and sold to the highest bidder, their once fierce discipline replaced by a mercenary indifference. The Valerians, cornered and desperate, felt the walls closing in, the suffocating pressure of an empire teetering on the brink of absolute collapse. His legitimate heir, Cassian, was an undeniable liability, a fatal flaw in the imperial design. To pass the scepter to him would be to sign the empire's death warrant, to condemn generations to come to an era of unmitigated chaos and certain ruin. The old methods, the traditional alliances, the established protocols, they were all failing, unraveling like a threadbare tapestry. It was in this crucible of extreme duress, in the darkest, most desolate hours of his reign, that an unthinkable idea, a notion so profoundly transgressive, it defied the very fabric of civilized thought, began to take root in Valerius's mind. It emerged not as a sudden revelation, but as a creeping, insidious whisper, born of desperation and amplified by the chilling logic of political survival. He had discussed the dire state of the empire with his most trusted and equally desperate advisors, men whose loyalty was perhaps less to him and more to the continuation of the imperial system, regardless of the ethical cost. They spoke of the purity of the bloodline, the need for an heir of unparalleled strength and unquestionable legitimacy, one who could command the respect of the legions, can cow the rebellious provinces into submission. They murmured of ancient precedents, of myths where gods married their own progeny to maintain cosmic order, of obscure philosophical treatises that argued for the absolute power of the sovereign, even over the most sacred of bonds. These were not direct suggestions, not outright endorsements of incest, but rather subtle nudges, veiled references to extraordinary measures for extraordinary times. One particularly cunning courtier, a master of insinuation, once remarked, "Sire, the strength of the oak lies in its deepest roots. When the trunk itself is threatened, sometimes one must draw upon the very essence of its being to ensure its survival. The purest lineage, the most unblemished continuation of power, must be secured, whatever the cost to conventional sentiment. What is mere sentiment when the very foundations of the world tremble?" The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Valerius, his mind already a labyrinth of desperate calculations, began to consider the unthinkable. If Cassian was a liability, and a new heir was needed, one imbued with the full authority and undeniable legacy of his imperial lineage, Then how could this be achieved? A new marriage for himself? At his age, and with the precarious state of the empire, a suitable noblewoman who could immediately bear a strong, legitimate heir was a pipe dream. The political alliances such a marriage would entail would be too complex, too fraught with new risks, new factions, and new enemies. No, the solution, if there was to be one, had to be absolute, undeniable, and immediate. And then the horrifying thought solidified. Aurelia, his daughter, the one with his intellect, his strength, his understanding of the empire's plight. If she were to become not just his most trusted advisor, but his actual consort, his empress, the mother of a new legitimate heir, an heir whose claim to the throne would be utterly unassailable, imbued with the purest possible imperial blood, would that not secure the future? The thought was repugnant, an affront to every moral and social code, a violation of the most fundamental human taboos. He felt a visceral revulsion, a cold dread that seized him by the throat. He paced his private chambers for days, his mind, a tempest of conflicting emotions, disgust, terror, but also a burgeoning, desperate hope. The very idea was anathema, a perversion, a monstrous act. Yet the alternative was the complete and utter dissolution of his empire, a descent into chaos and oblivion, the extinction of his dynasty, the erasure of his legacy, the suffering of millions. Which was the greater evil? The internal struggle was agonizing. He wrestled with his conscience, with the specter of ancient laws and divine prohibitions. He prayed to the gods, seeking guidance, but received only a terrifying silence, broken by the incessant clamor of a dying world. The political reality was stark, brutal, and unyielding. The legitimacy of his rule was eroding, his personal authority waning. He needed an act of decisive, almost shocking, power to reassert his control, to consolidate his dynasty, and to present a united, unchallengeable front to both his internal enemies and external aggressors. He needed to create an heir of unquestionable, unassailable legitimacy, an heir whose claim would be so profoundly rooted in the imperial lineage that no one could possibly challenge it. The purity of the bloodline, that insidious whisper, began to morph from a euphemism into a terrifyingly literal solution. He began to rationalize. The empire was not merely a collection of provinces and peoples. It was a sacred entity, a divine mandate, a legacy stretching back millennia. Its survival, he argued to himself, transcended all personal morality, all conventional ethics. The needs of the many, the preservation of civilization itself, outweighed the abhorrence of a single, transgressive act. He convinced himself that the gods themselves surely would understand such a dire sacrifice, such a profound measure undertaken for the ultimate good. He would present it not as a marriage of lust or depravity, but as a solemn, sacred duty, a desperate, last-ditch effort to save their world from utter annihilation. He meticulously constructed the arguments for his inner circle, selecting only those advisers whose desperation mirrored his own, whose moral compass had already been severely warped by the relentless pressures of survival. He spoke of an ancient, forgotten custom, a primordial tradition from the deepest, most sacred origins of their civilization, a time when kings were seen as living gods, beyond the petty morality of mortals, their actions dictated by a higher cosmic necessity. He cited obscure passages from forgotten texts, selectively interpreting prophecies and archaic legal codes to support his monstrous proposal. He spoke of the desperate need to unify the fragmented imperial bloodline to create a singular, unchallenged claim to the throne, one that would make any future usurpation utterly unthinkable. He emphasized the fragile state of Cassian, painting his son as a well-meaning but utterly incapable individual whose ascension would plunge the empire into immediate and irreversible civil war, a conflict that would inevitably lead to its utter dismemberment at the hands of its ravenous enemies. Aurelia, he argued, was not merely his daughter, but a vessel of imperial destiny, a woman of such unique intellect and strength that she was destined to play a pivotal, perhaps unprecedented, role in the empire's salvation. Her union with him, he posited, would not be a conventional marriage, but a sacred, symbolic merging of the deepest roots of their dynasty, a spiritual and political act designed to infuse the very heart of the empire with renewed vigor and unassailable legitimacy. It would be an act of profound, almost divine, self-sacrifice on both their parts for the greater good of all. To his horror and to his profound relief, his most desperate advisers, perhaps equally terrified by the looming collapse, or perhaps merely opportunistic in the extreme, did not dismiss him outright. Instead, they began to nod slowly, their eyes reflecting a terrifying blend of understanding, resignation, and perhaps a perverse kind of admiration for his audacity. They began to echo his arguments, refining them, packaging them for public consumption, devising a strategy to present this abomination as a necessary, even divinely ordained, act of preservation. The narrative they crafted was one of ancient prophecy, of a sacred duty imposed upon the royal house in times of ultimate crisis, a burden only the strongest and most self-sacrificing could bear. They would portray Aurelia as a willing participant, a patriotic princess sacrificing her personal life for the salvation of her people, though the truth was far more complex and heartbreaking. The preparations for the wedding were cloaked in a chilling veil of secrecy, a clandestine operation conducted in the heart of the imperial palace. The news, when it finally broke, was not a joyous announcement, but a thunderclap of shock and disbelief that reverberated through the capital like a funeral bell. The official decree, proclaimed by heralds with trembling voices, spoke of an ancient, solemn union, a sacred rite rediscovered in times of dire peril, designed to fortify the imperial line and bring divine favor upon the beleaguered empire. It spoke of a new era of stability, of an unshakable dynasty, of a golden future born from an unprecedented act of imperial fortitude. The public reaction was a horrifying mixture of stunned silence, murmured outrage, and paralyzed fear. Common citizens, their faces etched with confusion and disgust, struggled to reconcile this unthinkable act with the emperor they had once revered. The clergy, torn between their theological duties and their deep-seated fear of imperial reprisal, issued carefully worded, ambiguous statements, neither condemning nor endorsing the union, but effectively acquiescing to the emperor's horrifying decree. The more conservative elements of the nobility were appalled, their sense of moral order utterly shattered, but they were too terrified to openly defy Valerius, whose desperation had made him more ruthless and unpredictable than ever before. Any whisper of dissent was swiftly and brutally crushed, serving as a chilling warning to all who contemplated opposition. Aurelia, the tragic central figure in this macabre drama, became a pawn in her father's desperate game. Her own feelings were a tempest of confusion, dread, and a profound, agonizing sense of betrayal. She had always loved and respected her father, seeing him as a formidable, if distant figure, burdened by the immense weight of his office. Now that respect had curdled into a bitter cocktail of fear and resentment. She was a princess, but also a prisoner. Her life, her body, and her future irrevocably twisted to serve a political agenda that defied all natural law. There were no grand celebrations, no joyous feasts, no triumphant processions. The ceremony itself was a stark, somber affair, held within the confines of the imperial chapel, shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the low chanting of carefully selected priests, whose loyalty had been secured by a combination of threats and lavish promises. The air was thick with unspoken tension, with the palpable weight of transgression. Valerius, his face a mask of grim determination, stood beside his daughter, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen horizon, avoiding her gaze. Aurelia, pale and trembling, dressed in the heavy, symbolic robes of an empress, moved as if in a dream, her eyes devoid of light, her spirit shattered by the enormity of what was being done. Her hands, when they were joined with her father's for the ritual blessing, were cold and clammy, betraying the terror that gripped her heart. The vows exchanged were not of love or companionship, but of duty, of lineage, of the sacred bond to the empire, hollow words echoing in the hushed chamber, a grotesque mockery of a true marriage. Each word spoken, each gesture performed, felt like a hammer blow against the very soul, a descent into an abyss from which there was no return. The marriage, a perversion of a sacred institution, did achieve a fleeting, terrible success. For a brief period, the empire did experience a precarious calm. The shock of the emperor's audacious act, coupled with the brutal suppression of dissent, had a chilling effect. The rebels in the east, unsure of the new, terrifying stability within the capital, hesitated, their resolve momentarily fractured. The barbarian incursions, though still a threat, seemed to pause, as if even the most savage of enemies were momentarily bewildered by the emperor's unprecedented move. The loyalists, those who clung to the hope of the empire's survival at any cost, rallied around the seemingly revitalized imperial line, their faith renewed by the very extremity of Valerius's actions. The propaganda machine, working tirelessly, spun the narrative of a divinely ordained union, a miraculous act of imperial self-sacrifice that had averted certain doom. They emphasized the purity of the bloodline, the unblemished continuation of the sacred dynasty, a dynasty now reinforced by an act of profound, almost mythological significance. They declared that the gods themselves had blessed this union, choosing to overlook mortal transgressions for the sake of preserving the cosmic order embodied by the Shadow Empire. However, this fragile peace was built upon a foundation of sand, on a terrifying, morally bankrupt compromise that could not possibly endure. The long-term consequences were devastating, gnawing at the very soul of the empire from within. The public, though silenced by fear, harbored a deep, festering resentment. Morale plummeted, a silent, pervasive malaise settling over the land. The legitimacy Valerius had so desperately sought was, in reality, replaced by a profound sense of moral decay, a chilling precedent that blurred the lines between law, ethics, and desperate expediency. The empire, though superficially stable, was sick, its very spirit poisoned by the unnatural union at its core. Aurelia, the tragic empress, became a spectral figure in the imperial court. She bore her father a son, a new heir, whose existence was meant to solidify the dynasty, but his birth was shrouded in a cloud of controversy and whispered condemnation. The child, innocent yet forever, marked by the circumstances of his conception, became a living symbol of the empire's moral bankruptcy, a testament to the depths to which its ruler had sunk. Aurelia herself, once a woman of intellect and spirit, withered under the weight of her unbearable burden. Her eyes, once keen and intelligent, now held a haunted, distant look, reflecting a profound and unhealable wound. She performed her duties as empress with a mechanical detachment, a shadow of her former self, her laughter extinguished, her joy utterly consumed by the grotesque reality of her existence. She never truly recovered, her spirit irrevocably broken by the demands placed upon her. Valerius, too, paid a terrible price. The act, though politically expedient, corroded his soul. The desperate hope that had driven him to such a transgression slowly turned to ash in his mouth. He found no true peace, no lasting stability, only a profound and crushing loneliness. The fleeting calm was precisely that, fleeting. The barbarians, having regrouped and realized the empire's inherent weakness, resumed their assaults with renewed vigor. The internal factions, though initially cowed, began to scheme once more, their disgust now outweighing their fear, their plots more desperate and violent. The empire continued its agonizing, inevitable decline, its fate sealed not by external enemies, but by the internal rot of a leadership that had sacrificed its very morality for a fleeting moment of control. The act of marrying his own daughter, meant to be his salvation, became instead a chilling monument to his ultimate failure, a testament to the inherent unsustainability of power gained through unholy means. His legacy, once destined to be that of a courageous, if desperate, restorer, was irrevocably stained, forever remembered not for his intellect or his will, but for the unthinkable transgression that defined his reign. He died, not in battle, but alone in his palace, haunted by the specter of his choices, leaving behind an empire teetering on the very brink of utter collapse, its moral compass shattered, its people disillusioned, and its future uncertain. The son born of that abhorrent union, burdened by the weight of his incestuous parentage, struggled to hold together the crumbling remnants of his father's cursed inheritance, ultimately failing, bringing the dynasty to its ignominious end. The story of Emperor Valerius serves as a chilling, profound cautionary tale, a stark reminder that while power can tempt individuals to the most transgressive acts, such measures rarely, if ever, secure lasting dominion. Instead, they often accelerate the very decline they sought to prevent, leaving behind only a trail of moral ruin and indelible scars upon the annals of history. The muted historian continues to sift through the echoes of the past, unearthing the dark truths and the forgotten lessons that still resonate in our world today, reminding us that the human heart, driven by desperation and ambition, can be a labyrinth of unimaginable darkness. And in that darkness, the echoes of Valerius's desperate choice reverberate, a chilling testament to the lengths one might go when confronted with the terrifying prospect of losing everything, even if it means sacrificing every shred of one's own humanity and desecrating the most sacred of bonds. The very notion of an emperor, the supposed protector of his people, an upholder of moral order, resorting to such a profoundly incestuous union, forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of societal norms and the immense psychological pressures that can warp the minds of those burdened by ultimate power. It compels us to ask, at what point does the perceived necessity of survival override all established morality? When does the desperate desire to preserve a legacy become a self-consuming fire that incinerates every ethical boundary? Valerius, in his final moments, surely wrestled with these very questions, his conscience tormented by the monstrous decision that had defined his desperate reign. The marriage of his daughter, meant to be the linchpin of his dynasty's survival, became instead the very instrument of its moral and eventual physical undoing. His empire, a grand edifice built on centuries of tradition and law, crumbled not primarily from external assaults, but from an internal rot, a spiritual gangrene that set in the moment that unspeakable vow was uttered. The people, though terrified into silence, carried the burden of this transgression in their hearts. Their trust in the divine right of kings, their faith in the inherent righteousness of the imperial system, was irrevocably shattered. How could one believe in a just order when the very head of that order so flagrantly violated the most fundamental of human prescriptions? The philosophical ramifications alone were catastrophic, eroding the very intellectual and spiritual foundations upon which the empire had rested for so long. The scholars and philosophers of the era, those who dared to privately ponder the implications of the emperor's actions, found themselves grappling with a profound crisis of meaning. If the emperor, the living embodiment of the divine will, on earth could commit such an act, then what truly was the nature of morality? What was the purpose of laws? What was the meaning of civilization itself? These were not mere academic questions. They were corrosive acids eating away at the very fabric of intellectual and social cohesion. The long-term impact on the imperial family itself was equally tragic. The new heir, born from this abhorrent union, carried the silent stigma of his parentage, a burden that no crown could alleviate. He inherited a throne already weakened by moral decay, a court riddled with suspicion and resentment, and a populace whose loyalty was at best conditional, at worst entirely absent. His reign, brief and tumultuous, was plagued by internal strife and external pressures that he, despite his best efforts, could not overcome. The empire, already bleeding from 1,000 cuts, finally succumbed, not with a bang, but with a whimper extinguished by the slow, agonizing erosion of trust, legitimacy, and moral authority. The story of Valerius, though shrouded in the mists of a fictionalized past to protect the identity of an actual, obscure figure whose narrative closely mirrors this tragic tale, serves as a powerful allegory for the dangers of unchecked power and the corrupting influence of desperation. It is a cautionary narrative that transcends the boundaries of time and culture, a universal warning about the perils of sacrificing fundamental human values for perceived political expediency. The echoes of such desperate measures reverberate throughout history, manifesting in different forms, but always carrying the same bitter taste of compromise and eventual ruin. It reminds us that true strength lies not in the tyrannical imposition of will, nor in the desecration of sacred bonds, but in the unwavering adherence to principles, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The emperor who married his own daughter, a figure of profound tragedy and chilling precedent, forever stands as a dark beacon in the historical firmament, illuminating the abyss into which even the most powerful of individuals can fall when consumed by an unyielding desire to retain control at any cost. His story, whispered across the centuries, remains a stark, immutable warning against the ultimate corruption that power can wreak upon the human soul, a grim testament to the fact that some lines, once crossed, leave an indelible and ultimately fatal stain not only on the individual, but on the very civilization they sought so desperately to save. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the gravest threats to an empire often emanate not from its enemies beyond the gates, but from the moral decay fostered within its own leadership, a slow, insidious poison that ultimately proves far more lethal than any barbarian blade or rival army. The ultimate tragedy of Valerius was not merely the loss of his empire, but the loss of his own soul, a sacrifice made for nothing. If you enjoyed this journey into the darker corners of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Let us know in the comments below.